Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Alisha Powell, and I'm joined by Napar Shadar, who's going to be conducting today's interview. So over to you, Napar.
Thank you so much, Esoteric. I'm very pleased and honored to sit with this beautiful sister today, Dr. Powell. She addresses, I'm speaking about you in the third person first off, as just to introduce you. Dr. Powell addresses a very, very important topic that I think isn't spoken on enough: generational trauma affecting our people of the African slave ancestors, the progeny of the African slaves, Black people. She speaks about the generational trauma linked to the church. So, Dr. Powell, thank you so much, first off, for joining us and letting me sit down and talk to you about this. Before I get into the questioning, tell us a little bit about yourself and, your journey and what you've done as far as your research on this.
Definitely, of course. And thank you so much for having me. So my journey through this topic and this area of specialty has been something that I kind of fell into. I was raised in a very conservative Christian background. I was actually homeschooled all the way into college. So that was my first experience with traditional education. So I was homeschooled and had a lot of religious background and education just through that aspect alone. But additionally, as I kind of progressed through graduate school and doing doctoral studies, I saw more and more information and just kind of, kind of peaks of the fact that a lot of times religious trauma is something that isn't always talked about. And as I went through my own journey and kind of started to divorce myself from some of the ideas that are related to religious trauma and my own upbringing, I realized that there were so many other people in a similar position. And so I've done a lot of research on this. I've read several books on it, but I've also developed it as a specialty kind of based on, number one, my own experience, but also my background in counseling families and couples, where there's people who are coming from different religious backgrounds and they're in the process of really trying to figure out what they believe for themselves and why. And a lot of times they find themselves at that crossroads of, what do I believe and how is this different than what I've been taught to believe and why? So that's something that kind of piqued my interest and also kind of brought me to this topic and made it one of my areas of specialty.
Wow, wonderful. Wonderful. I want to just jump right in and ask you.
Sure.
With our unique, with our unique history, which is the history of the horrific history of the slave trade, we have what is known as PTSS. I'm sure you're familiar with post-traumatic slave syndrome, referencing the research of Dr. Joy DeGreen. Now, as African progeny of African slaves, as Black people, the church has been the center of everything for us. The church has been our base, our refuge, and our support. However, with the PTSS, the trauma, we know that we've been surviving and constantly, having to struggle with religion because of the PTSS. Talk to us from an angle of how we're affected, how that trauma that's encoded in us is affected when we think of church and religion. Can you talk to us about that?
Absolutely. I think you made a great point about drawing the connection between slavery and post-traumatic slave syndrome and how that's related to religious trauma. When we think about, how our ancestors were enslaved without any resources or any support, they were given Christianity as a way to kind of help them become better slaves. They say that Christianity is one of those things where it's actually the conqueror's religion. So basically the country that conquered the other country adopted those religious practices. And Christianity was in a lot of ways thrust on us because we were a conquered people. We were enslaved. We didn't have a choice. When slaves came from Africa, we were given new names. We had to adapt to a new society. We were given a new culture. And we were also told that we were also told that this Bible is the truth. Slaves oftentimes had the day off on Sundays or Saturdays, whatever, depending on what religious faith the owner was of, but they knew that there was a day of rest. And so the Bible and Christianity were given to slaves as basically a literal way to help them continue to work and continue to produce for the people that were enslaving them. So as part of that aspect, slaves were told that regardless of what happens here on earth, you have a reward in heaven. And when you think about it, that's one of the biggest lies as far as being able to keep people enslaved, but also subjugated under a very oppressive rule, is telling them that life is going to be rough here, but your reward is in heaven. You're going to get eternal life. It's still going to be good because you're working towards something, something bigger and something better. There's going to be a heaven after this life and when everything ends. And those ideas are even reflected in some of the spirituals that we sing and that we think of when slaves were talking about, I got his shoes, all God's children got his shoes. When I get to heaven, I'm going to walk all over God's heaven. And so slaves were enslaved people, saw that as their route out. The next life was the life that they wanted to live and the life that they were looking towards. And so they were told that, if you're good, if you don't, disobey your master, you're going to have eternal life or a life of paradise. And those ideals were in a lot of ways thrust into enslaved Africans. And they adopted it because it's something that made sense to them, number one, but also helped them to manage and cope with some of the stresses that came with being enslaved and having families ripped apart in a lot of traumatic ways.
Wow. Well, and in your opinion, how do we as Black people, with the history of church being so programmed into us, and knowing like the Underground Railroad, that was like you said, that was our escape. How do we do we throw it all away, or how do we still? What I'm trying to say is, do we get rid of all of the Black culture that is steeped in the church? How do we work that out as Black people when we find out, wow, this is what the oppressor put on us. This wasn't ours. How do we work that out?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. I think the answer to it really depends on the individual. But when we're talking about the group in general, I think it's important to recognize that a lot of times the Bible isn't necessarily meant to always be taken literally. And that's something that, I think sometimes we may struggle with as Black people, is that we take it literally. And if we were to take it in a way where we're saying these are great stories, it gives us morals, it gives us values, but we don't take it as literal as we were intended to take it, I think that can give us maybe some psychological distance between some of the hurt and harm, but also recognizing that a lot of people still do find value in religion and that it can be a healthy place of peace for them. And we don't necessarily always have to be so confrontational in saying that every religion is bad, and in no way, shape, or form do we want to believe in a higher power. But I think that there needs to be some nuance around, is this something that needs to guide our every life? Are we talking about religion as a way of life? Or are we talking about religion as a technology, as far as a way for us to see the world in a way that helps us better relate to our fellow man, and as a way for us to move forward in a positive way? Can this still be a beacon of positivity while also not necessarily internalizing some of the very negative aspects of control and coercion and, giving all your money to feed the poor, or to your rich pastor that, already has enough money? Is there a way that we can see it for what it is, but also still retain our culture and still recognize that we are a people of community? We're a people of relationship. And so many times the church has been that meeting place for Black people, whether it came to, fighting for civil rights or talking about, ways that they could come together as community. The church has really been that cornerstone for Black people. And so I think it's important to realize that it's not necessarily helpful to discard it all, but it is important, I think, to look at it a little bit differently and recognize that we can still have that community and still have that relationship, while not also maybe internalizing some of the negativity and some of those negative belief systems that also keep us in the same place.
Right. Do you think that the Abrahamic religions, like especially Christianity, do you think that there's a lot of fear that those particular religions instill in people, especially our people with our history?
Yeah, I think there definitely can be fear. I think a lot of times the Abrahamic religions are used as a vehicle in order to keep people down, and in a lot of ways prevent them from really taking personal responsibility and moving ahead in their lives. If you're told that, you know, your actions are, if you're told that your environment is a result of the actions that you've made, or because you've sinned in some way, or because God doesn't love you, or you've done something to step out of, you know, God's path, then that can be obviously very detrimental, because that also means that you are internalizing the fact that you may be a bad person, and you also may not necessarily take responsibility for some of the choices that you've made. And one thing about religion is that a lot of times it casts the blame elsewhere. It basically prevents people from shining the light on themselves and recognizing, I'm a person that can take personal responsibility for my life, versus I'm a person who's sinful and these things are happening to me because I did something wrong, or it's something that I need to repent of. And the more that we can maybe take personal responsibility, and also realize that religion was designed to help us, you know, stay positive, and it can be designed to bring us together, but it doesn't have to be the foundation of all the ways that we see the world. And it doesn't have to guide every aspect of our life. It can be something that we can use when we need it, but we can put it away when it's time to work and be productive. It doesn't have to be an all-encompassing, overarching idea.
Right. So what you're saying is we don't need to discard, obviously you said this, we don't need to discard our spirituality, which, by the way, I want to ask you, can you give us some history of what your take is about the history of us before we were in slavery, about our African history? Our African spirituality. What do we do with that? Or how do we link back to that? Or should we?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to recognize that even prior to slavery, before Black people came to the United States, we already had a spiritual system. We had our own practices and traditions, and we had our own ways of bringing ourselves together as a community. And so what those traditions were a variety of different things. And depending on what part of Africa Africans were from, you know, a lot of times their religion depended on the part of the country that they were in, part of the continent that they were in. And so a lot of times our religious practices, they were discarded when we came to the United States, because we were told you can't practice these things. There were slaves and there were enslaved people that did still engage in some of those traditional African spiritual practices. But you know, throughout slavery, and also throughout, you know, generations after generations being enslaved, a lot of those traditions and those rituals were lost as a result of being assimilated to the dominant, you know, community and the culture at that time. And so I think it's so important to recognize that a lot of the spiritual practices, maybe a lot of the things that we do in Christianity, can be a reflection of, you know, that deep ancestral, you know, search for meaning. In a lot of ways, it maybe can mirror something that our ancestors did, because a lot of Christianity is borrowed or taken away from some of the spiritual practices of the African people. And so, you know, we need to return to our roots, you know, no pun intended, but that's one of I think the most important things when we look at the role of religion, and we look at, you know, some of the benefits of religion, and the fact that it does bring us together and it does bond us in a positive way.
Wow, thank you for that. Speaking, when I'm listening to you, I think about when you said roots. A lot of us now we're going back, we're seeking, we're doing our DNA testing, we're trying to put the pieces together of this puzzle, as far as, you know, finding out who we are. And for so long in slavery, as you know, with religion, with the Black church, we've seen a white God and white Jesus. Mm-hmm. We didn't see anything African. So can you talk to us about how that programming and that generational self-deprecation, low self-esteem has mm-hmm. been really pushed by the church, always mm-hmm. seeing the great white God. Can you talk to us about how that's affected us, and what should we do about it?
Yeah, you know, I think the impact has been widespread in a lot of ways. You know, there's hymns where we sing that we want to be whiter than snow. Yes, whiter than snow. I want to be whiter than snow. And when you think about just the internal programming that happens when you're equating Black with bad and white with good, when you're talking about purity and being pure, and how that's always equated with whiteness, whether it's symbolic or literal, it's always associated with whiteness. Many times in mainstream Christianity, there are the depictions of a white Jesus and what he looks like, and that he's, the savior for all. And I think Christianity is very insidious in that it gives a representation that there is no cultures, that we're all one in Christ, but we're all one in a white Jesus. And that can be really insidious, because it also makes us look at being white as, I would say, as the biggest priority. And so we are more likely to disengage with our own culture, because we see this as the dominant culture and the depiction that we need to strive towards. And that internal programming can also keep us from really being successful. If we believe that we're bad because we're Black, or because, we're sinners in some way, shape, or form, our decisions are going to reflect the fact that we think negatively of ourselves. And I think, across the board, a lot of times African Americans just struggle with self-esteem and confidence, because we're not told that it's okay to be you, but it's okay to take pride in your culture and in your racial background and in your ethnic identity. And that's something that the church has taken away from us being secure and confident in ourselves. It's put a white Jesus on a pedestal. And those ideas have been really harmful for us as a people, because we've seen that as our goal, when that never really was our goal. And so it's been insidious. It's also been really detrimental.
Right. When you talked about looking, I was thinking, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was remembering the curse of Ham, cursed. And then, of course, it says in the Strong's dictionary, Ham, these are all the descendants, the African people are the descendants of Ham. So yes, it is there's a strong programming of self-hate. What about the white? I was going to ask you about white Christians, but before I do that, because I have a good question for you, and I appreciate your answers. They're very, very eye-opening and enlightening. Thank you. I've seen some Black churches, and I'm not scoffing or mocking anyone out there, but I've seen them really try to approach African culture and integrate it into their teachings. I don't know if you're familiar with that as well, Doctor. How effective is that? Does that work?
I'm not as familiar with that. I know that when we think about Black churches, I automatically think of mega churches that have 7,000 plus members, where it's kind of like a city church, where it's kind of a mini city in and of itself. It works like a production. Right. There's this big, huge effort. They have like the stage, and people are singing, and they have ushers and so many things that they're doing for the community, whether it's feeding the homeless or going into correctional facilities, or just providing, additional resources to people who need jobs or need support. And so I see that as, maybe in some ways being a reflection of African spirituality, in that there's a community aspect to it. It's not just one person feeling like they belong. It really, I think, meets the need of people to belong in general. Knowing that you belong to a big church, you see church members on the street, you see your pastor, you have that sense of community and that sense of belonging. And those things can be helpful for a lot of people, but it can also be detrimental, because it means that you are automatically influenced by whoever is at the top and what they're saying. That means that a lot of times people take things very literally. And the whole idea of the whole prosperity gospel and giving your money to the church and sowing a seed and, putting money or sowing seeds into the church, into their mission, also means that people a lot of times go without, because they're sowing money that should have been going to like their bills or other priorities that they had in their life. And they're told that God will give it back to you if you give it to me. And that type of programming can be very problematic, because it also means that there's a lack of fiscal responsibility. And when you're giving resources, and when you're literally sacrificing your resources, your time and money, that also means that you don't necessarily always have the same resources to invest in yourself, to invest in your children, to invest in your education, because you're told that you're going to get it back. This is the investment. You're sowing a seed. You're going to get a blessing because you've given this money. And that type of programming can be really harmful, because it also means that people aren't necessarily always taking care of the things that should be a priority over that.
Wow. That's very true, and that's a very sad truth about our culture. The pastor he has so much power over the congregation. Now, with that said, how do we break free of that type of trauma? Because I mean, that to me is a part of the trauma, because during slavery, the pastor or the preacher was set up, and he was also a type of spy at times, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was not always, he seemed supportive, but really he was more of an extension of the slave master. So how if we were to speak to Christians, or let me ask you, do you ever speak to Christians about the generational trauma related to religion? Do you ever speak to Christians about that? And how would we approach a Christian to try to get through to them? Because the preacher has a great hold on people. How do you do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of Christians around, religious trauma and what that looks like. I think it's important to keep in mind that religious trauma can look different for different people. And even individuals who have gone to the same church or have been a part of the same denomination, the same group, can have a totally different experience than the other person. And so that also means that the effects of trauma can be different, varying from one person to the other. I think that it's important to keep in mind that, when we're thinking about, generational trauma, and when we're thinking about religious trauma, it's also important to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And we can't necessarily talk about, Christianity and the Black church in general without talking about the emasculation of men and the fact that the church mainly runs on volunteer labor. A lot of times people are volunteering their time, their energy. They're not full-time staff employed by the church. They're not a lot of times part-time staff employed by the church. They are taking time off of work. They are going to the church, at times where they could have been helping their children with their homework. They are dedicating copious amounts of time and energy. And a lot of times, the majority of individuals within a church who are doing a lot of the labor and a lot of the tasks are women. And so the Black church in general has been, dominated by women as far as the workforce. A lot of times the person in charge may be, a male, but when it comes to people who are actually doing things and are giving of their time and resources, a lot of times it's very female driven. And that's one of the things that I think are also impacting the marital rates within the Black community, is the fact that we're giving so much to the church and we're not getting any back. We're not investing in our personal relationships. We're only investing in what we believe to be the future, the promised land, the goal, prosperity, heaven, paradise, whatever that is. And so it also causes us to lose sight of the importance of forming our own personal relationships with each other. And so that the church has taken the place of a man for a lot of single Black women. And that's been problematic in our marriage rates, and also in our high rates of marital instability too.
Oh, wow. That was really impactful what you just said. That is absolutely true. I've heard so many of our sisters, Black women, say, I'm married to Jesus. Jesus is there was a woman, I don't want to start laughing because it's very serious, but I saw a woman on YouTube. Her channel name was, I'm Jesus's wife. And she really spoke about that. So yeah, that's very true. So you would say that how much of that is really responsible for the divorce? Because you always hear about the man doesn't want to be dragged to the church. Mm-hmm. Like, would you say there's a substantial amount of families being broken up because of the church?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, when we think about men and women and the fact that we're different in a lot of different ways, we're different beings. We're meant to be complements to each other. Women do tend to be a little bit more emotional than men when it comes to certain things. And the church definitely appeals to emotions. When you think about altar calls, when you think about the emotional aspect and the way that a lot of songs move you, and the fact that, the preaching and the words that are used, they resonate with you. There's an emotional pull towards staying there and staying within that environment because it feels safe and it feels good. And so I think women are more susceptible to those types of environments, just because we like to feel good. We like to be in a good environment. It's something that brings us peace, but also it's something that can help us cope with a lot of the life stressors that we may face. And so when we're thinking about that, with the emotional aspect of church, it also a lot of times serves as a repellent for men who sometimes are a little bit more logical and more rational and are asking more questions about, okay, what is this? Why is it this way? What does this look like? Why are you giving our money to this church when it could be, better used in our household? And the church, I think in general, does serve as a repellent to men, which also means that women maybe are tasked with choosing their man or their husband or their partner, or choosing the church. And they're told that, God will give you a man if you pray enough, if you sow enough seed, if you spend enough time, that you'll get a God-fearing man, and the church is going to be the vehicle that's going to give you that man. But in reality, they're basically giving up a physical, real man for an invisible one. And that's just detrimental in general.
Wow. As a therapist, I want you to answer this question from your experience with dealing with people who are struggling with mental illness, behavioral disorders. I don't see this. Now, this is my opinion, and then I'm going to ask you about the church. I don't see enough Black people really vigilantly seeking out professional health care as far as mental health care goes. And you could speak on this, but I think that's cultural. Do you think the church has encouraged people to just not go seek professional therapy and just to come to the church for all of that?
Well, I think the answer to that really kind of is two-sided. Number one, yes, the church has historically discouraged people from seeking outside support, outside resources. A lot of the times, if a woman may be in a domestic abusive situation, the pastor may counsel her to stay with her husband or stay in this really bad situation because that's what he believes is the best thing. And so the church a lot of times has given us a Band-Aid when it comes to dealing with severe mental illness or relationship issues, being told to pray about it or come talk to the pastor about it or come down for an altar call and we'll pray over you. The church has been that go-to for a lot of people. And they've also historically discouraged a lot of people from seeking professional help. But on the same token, we also have to recognize that the counseling professional in general has been very Eurocentric. So the model of counseling that a lot of counselors use is very Eurocentric when it comes to what we call ethical boundaries and not speaking to somebody if you see them outside the therapy room and keeping that very, very hard line between like professional and personal. And as Black people, that doesn't resonate well with us. We like all of our things integrated. If we see somebody on the street that we know, regardless of whether they're a therapist or they're a coach or teacher, we want to say hi. And, the Eurocentricness of the counseling profession in general can also be a repellent, or also, can be one of those things that maybe make Black people a little bit less wanting to engage in that process. So it's important to recognize that a lot of it is, the church doing it, but a lot of it is people's experience with counseling, the fact that maybe they've worked with a professional that didn't necessarily know about Black culture or asked them specific questions that they didn't feel like the therapist was competent in asking those questions in general. So people have had bad experiences in counseling too, which a lot of ways pushes them back into the church because they're like, I found a therapist, but I didn't like the therapist, so I'll talk to my pastor.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Doctor. I wanted to talk to you about the sexual abuse of women being, in my opinion, from what I've seen in the Bible, facilitated by a lot of Abrahamic teachings. I have spoken extensively and had lots of conversations about the parts of the Bible that say rape is mitigated for. You can have sex with this woman if you take this captive. Can you talk to us about how detrimental that is even today, as far as the church and the way women, and maybe even some boys, but especially women, are taken advantage of?
Yeah. I think you made a great point about that. A lot of times when we think about like just the Bible in general, so much is, picked and chose from different aspects of the Bible. There are, laws within, different states and different countries that are in direct contradiction to some of the Old Testament laws when it came to, a woman's ability to choose, a woman's consent. Those were all things that, were allowed in the Bible that in today's society, we say, no, that's against the law. You'll do jail time if you perpetrate some of these acts. And so there's this incongruency between, people who say they follow the Bible and a lot of times the laws of the land. And, when it comes to supporting women who are in these difficult situations, a lot of times pastors aren't necessarily equipped in any way, shape, or form. They haven't had any type of counseling training to be able to adequately counsel and direct them to the right resources and support. And many times pastors and other leaders are involved in cover-ups where they're trying to cover up these heinous acts that have occurred. And, it's not uncommon for it to tear a congregation apart because there's people that believe more in the mission than they believe in the people. And when you believe more in the mission of a church versus like the people within a church, that's when it really becomes abusive and it becomes an unhealthy environment for everyone because they put the mission above actually, being good to each other and making the reports and reporting any type of criminal acts that have occurred because they believe that the mission is bigger than the people. And so it's easy, I think, as Black people for us to lose sight of the importance of that community and what support really looks like and what a healthy dynamic, a congregational dynamic looks like, because we see the person or the person who's purported themselves to be the man of God, the pastor. We can't speak against the pastor. God will, get me, or he'll not think highly of me because I spoke against the man of God. And so those ideas are really held as a cloud over our heads. And it really, I think, holds people from speaking up and also reporting things that they've seen or they've observed or they've heard about.
Wow, thank you so much. I had mentioned earlier that I wanted to ask you about white Christians. The reason I said that is, do you think that knowing the history, the trauma and this, the way the Black church has worked against Black people, do you think there is any type of responsibility that white Christians or even the church in general, do they have any responsibility to really speak more about just how much trauma has been inflicted upon the progeny of African slaves, and even to educate their people about the slave Bible? What responsibility do Christians have, especially white Christians, when it comes to that aspect?
Well, I think there definitely is a need for white Christianity to take responsibility for some of the acts and some of the things that have happened over the centuries that have, really, basically damaged Black people in a lot of ways. I don't think that will happen on a widespread scale just because it's damaging to the brand and it's damaging to, the image that they want to portray through the media or, through their publishing or marketing materials. And so that acknowledgement or that acknowledgement of harm that's been done, I don't think that there's ever going to be a widespread "we're sorry" or some type of statement. I know that there are denominations that have made, systemic statements saying that we recognize that we played a role in some of this systemic oppression and that we played a role in the enslavement of other people. But when it comes to what that means for us today, I don't necessarily see, mainstream Christianity as taking a solidified, united front of saying, hey, we need to take a step back. We've done a lot of harm. I don't see that happening just because it's $1 billion industry and a lot of people are profiting off of those who have given and sown and given money and time into those big agencies or those big churches.
Well, when I hear you say the money and the time, I mean, it's like a coconut dropping onto my head. We really don't think about how much free labor the church has exploited people. I mean, I'm getting a little choked up. I'm serious. I never even thought about it and extensively, taking the time. They've really, throughout the ages, used people to basically make a $1 billion industry.
Yeah.
So wow, that is very. What do we say to people who have been um, church hurt? I know a lot of people don't like to hear that. They don't like that phrase. What do we say to our people who we see leaving the church? Do we continue to support them? Because I was going to actually preface this with, there are more and more Black atheists than ever before. It used to be an anomaly to see a Black atheist, but now there are so many. So do we continue to support them? Because a lot of them, I will, before I hand this over to you, a lot of them are very, very angry. So what do we do? Like, how do we handle that?
Yeah, well, I definitely think that more support is needed. Everybody is at a different point in their journey. And for some people, atheism is kind of that natural inclination, because it's like, I want to divorce myself from every single aspect that's been hurtful. And I just want to like be away from all of this, all these things, because I have a really negative connotation with it. And there's also people who, maybe say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual and I still believe in a higher power. And, I still pray before meals and I still believe that I'm a good person. And I believe that God knows my heart and whatever happens, happens. And so there's, I think, different points on the spectrum when it comes to how far people want to go from religion. Maybe atheism is like maybe more on the far side, but maybe there's a like optimistic agnostic who says, I believe that there's a God, but I can't really say anything much past that. I'm okay with that. That works for me. And I think it's important to support people wherever they are in that journey and figuring out what that meaning is for them, whether it means that they start to investigate or experiment or just start to explore some of the other ancient African practices that, that they have access to, or whether it means that they actively look for community in maybe more of an atheist circle or agnostic circle, where they still have that sense of community, but they also have that sense of, I don't know the full truth, but I know that what's not the truth, and it's not this. And so I think there's some room for nuance, and there's some room for support on all edges of that spectrum, whether it means that somebody's leaving religion, or it means that they're an atheist or agnostic, or just exploring, what religion means to them, or just exploring their spirituality in general.
Wow. So, sometimes I am on a platform that does a lot of debating about religion. And one thing I know about our people, we are always looking for the truth or the religion that we can cling to. So when I see the atheists, they come in, I really love talking to you. I'm telling you, because I'm thinking about how sometimes I'm not very sensitive to them. So when the atheists come in, they're the ones that seem like they're always the underdog. They're always the ones like trying to get through and say, get away from it all, divorce it all. And I think that is a good idea to maybe reboot, dump it all and then come back and start fresh. If you don't mind, I wanted to ask you just not a very personal question, but just something about yourself. Are you an atheist? Are you what type of spirituality do you lean toward?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I know for me, I think that my beliefs are always evolving, and that's something that I've grown to be okay with. Growing up in a very strict household or a conservative Christian household, there was a set of rules or a set of right or wrong. It's black or white. It's heaven or hell. It's so binary. And one thing that's happened as I've become an adult, and as I've gotten a chance to kind of explore different parts of spirituality and really do some reading on my own, exploring it, is that I've recognized that I'm okay with like not knowing for sure. I'm okay with being in that gray area of, I'm not quite sure, but I'm okay with not being quite sure. And I feel better than saying I'm subscribed to everything, and I feel better than just saying I'm a complete atheist. I like knowing that I don't know. And I think that's really where I have the room for growth. And that's really, I think, the approach that I use with a lot of the clients that I work with is that, I'm not going to insert my personal beliefs into this, but let's help you explore what this means to you. Because for you, that may mean being an atheist or an agnostic or just being spiritual instead of religious. Let's find out what that meaning is for you. And so in my journey, I think I have waves of, I believe more, not as much. It it really depends on the day, and a lot of times my reading and what I've arrived at. But I will say that I haven't arrived at a very clear-cut conclusion of all of it. I think part of life is just growth and recognizing that it's okay to get new information and to inform our mindset and our alignment as we get new information, as we grow and evolve as people.
Right. Wow, that's beautiful, actually. I like what you said earlier about, you didn't say it specifically this way, but this is how I processed it. Don't let religion control your life. It should be enriching, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I spoke earlier a little bit about the importance of maybe thinking about religion as a technology versus something that we take literally. If you, I think it's a difference between believing and acting as if you believe. So, and the difference between that is you get the same result, but it's not as internally incongruent. So for instance, you can say, I believe that, you may not believe the 10 commandments, but you may act as if you believe the 10 commandments are true and that you don't commit adultery, you don't murder people. You have the same result, you have the same action, but it doesn't mean that you've internalized or taken it literally. You're merely acting as if you believe, because a lot of our society is really seeped in Judeo-Christian values. And that's really what has been the bedrock and the foundation for many of our modern civilizations. It has been on Judeo-Christian values. And a lot of our laws reflect Judeo-Christian values. We think about the way that we see the world and the fact that, a lot of times, even at major events, somebody may say a prayer or somebody may say something, that alludes to God or, the Holy Spirit in some way, shape, or form. So I think there's a difference between believing and then also recognizing that we can act as if we believe and be good people and still see value in people and still see the inherent worth of everyone. But it doesn't mean that we internalize a lot of those harmful edicts and a lot of those harmful thoughts that can come from internalizing and taking the Bible literally.
Right. Because there's a lot of condemnation that Judeo-Christian values are based on. And thinking about that, our society is so judgmental, and it reflects the Judeo-Christian values that our society's based on, shows why we can't get along. We always are. It seems like we're always looking down our noses at each other, sitting on the bema, and especially with Black people. I mean, with our people, So can you? Yeah. I appreciate you elaborating a little bit more on that, because that's very true about the condemnation, and the religion is very condemning.
Yeah, I think being able to kind of divorce that aspect of belief versus acting as if we believe can also maybe help us be more empathetic to individuals who are still within religion in some way, shape, or form. I've talked before about kind of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but also recognizing the importance of not taking everything as literal and knowing that there's some room for nuance. There's some room for us developing our own beliefs and our own personal values that may be outside the constructs of a really strict religion or denomination. There's room for us to think about people as multifaceted and knowing that, we may think something one day, but with new information, we can grow and evolve. And we also have to give people permission and understanding as they grow and evolve. And so where someone may be on their journey in spirituality and religion may be a completely different point than where someone else will be. And I think there's such a need for more communication, but more dialogue around where people are in that conversation. And I think the Black church in general has tried to stifle independent thought in a lot of ways when it comes to people exploring and finding out new belief systems and really adjusting their values and their beliefs based on new information that they've received. And the more that we can kind of open the floodgates and really encourage free thought and free thinking and free speech, I think the better it is for us to arrive at conclusions that, reflect our personal values and our personal convictions.
Wow, I really appreciate it. I don't know how much more time I have, but I started, while I'm listening to you, I started thinking about how women are treated, and how you mentioned women are the majority of the church, but they do so much, but there's always that, it's like we've got the Black, all of the people controlled by the church, but then under that we have the woman, she's Black and she's a woman, and the church affects her even more. I read a book called Jezebel Unhinged. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it does speak how the Black church is with Black women and the control and oppression and exploitation and all of that. I know you touched on a little, but if you would, I would really love for you to just really elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about, the high rates of Black women within the church. It's been kind of a common knowledge that there tends to be more women than men, especially in the Black church. And I think that's not without like a reason. And one thing I've talked about in my circles when it comes to my colleagues is how the Black church is invested in keeping women single because that's their workforce. And so as soon as women get married, a lot of times they're engaged, they're married, they're dealing with family stuff, they're supporting their husband, they are now in partnership with someone else. That takes away from the time and resources that they were giving to the church, which also gives the church a motive for keeping them single and putting the pastor as the spiritual father of the congregation and setting them in places where, they don't have the time to date or to get to know other men or other potential partners because so much of their time and resources going to the church. And the church holds up marriage on such a high pedestal and basically promises women that, if you stay here, if you stay under this covering, under this church, then God will bring you a man. However, they keep women busy and they don't give them the time that they need to explore and really develop those personal relationships. So in a lot of ways, the church is working against women instead of for women. And I think that's a connection that we need to make and we need to be aware of.
Wow, that is powerful and that's very poignant. I mean, it's very sad, but when I'm listening to you, I think I'm putting the connection with the divorce rate of Black women and the high rate of unmarried Black women. Mm-hmm. This information is very, very eye-opening, Doctor. Thank you for that. I don't know if esoteric, yeah. Go ahead if you want to jump in. Thank you so much. This is very important information that I don't think I've heard people speak. I've never heard anyone else put the connection. So I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Wow. Thank you.
Dr.
Esoteric?
Powell, thank you. I really appreciate what you've brought to the table and discussed today. And Nepal, thank you.